Hi, I'm Martin Colthorpe, Programmer of Events as part of the New Dutch Writing campaign. New Dutch Writing is a programme of events, workshops, residencies and publishing projects which supports Dutch writing and its translation. Welcome to this first event in our online series featuring writers and their translators, whose work has recently been translated into English. Tonight's event features Tommy Wieringa and his translator Sam Garrett, discussing the Blessed Rita'We alongside our chair this evening, Suzi Feay. Suzi is a journalist and critic based in London and was the literary editor of The Independent on Sunday for 11 years. She currently reviews for the Financial Times and teaches journalism for creative writing students at Brunel University. This is the first in a series of events in partnership with National Centre for Writing and their Meet the World series, jointly supported by the Dutch Foundation for Literature and Flanders Literature. Do let us know your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag @NewDutchWriting or on YouTube, and do join us on Wednesday the 27th of May at 7 p.m. for our next event with Charlotte van den Broeck and her translator David Colmer. You can sign up at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a real privilege to be kicking off this wonderful series of online events. And it's a great privilege to be talking to Tommy and his longtime translator, Sam, specifically about this book, The Blessed Rita, as Martin has just said, which is available in this. It's been beautifully published by Scribe. It's very nice hardback. And I would say I very much recommend that you read this book, but if you do, don't do what I did, which is with about 100 pages to go, start reading at 11 o'clock at night, because I thought I'll read a couple of chapters. You'll be up till the early hours, which is what happened to me. It's got an interesting description on the back that it is darkly funny. It is certainly dark. It has funny elements. It has thriller elements, and it's also very much a literary novel. It's been brought to us in a wonderfully supple translation by Sam. So I'm delighted to be talking to both of them. Welcome both to this session.
I think all the nice things you just said about the book, thanks for that. But I think the credits go to Sam, because he made a wonderful translation, and he might even have made a book better than it actually was.
Oh, don't believe it for a minute.
Oh no, but it's true. It's true. You can. We as writers, we depend heavily on the work of translators. So I think I don't have the book here with me, but I think that the name of the translator should be on the cover as well, like in France.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it happens.
Do you collaborate quite closely on the translation? Is there a bit of back and forth between you?
No, Sam, he's been in the Netherlands for so long that all the sociolect, all the dialect, he has a good understanding of all that. I mean, he's originally from the US, but living in the Netherlands for how long, Sam?
40 years.
40 years already. So
yeah.
He doesn't need. But sometimes I do get questions. About 100 questions from translators from, let's say, Slovenia or something. But Sam only has about 5 to 10 questions.
That's right. I think that's probably true.
And in this book, they were mainly about the dialect spoken in the province where I'm from.
It's a rural setting, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And
yeah.
as I've said, the setting is in some ways key to the book. Did you feel that was a place you already knew, Sam, or you just go into the prose and get there that way?
It's not a place that I already know. I mean, I've been to the part of the country that Tommy writes about there, but I've never spent a lot of time there. So, by Dutch standards, it's quite funny because it's all very close by. But by Dutch standards, that's really sort of like an adventure to go off to that side of the country. It's maybe it's an hour and a half drive, something like that. So what are we talking about? No, but I think in this case, I read the book always beforehand, and then I just sort of I dove into it. Really, yeah.
You could get there through the language itself. So I think we have to credit you for that, Tommy.
Yeah, but the thing is that what Sam says, it's only a little more than 1.5 hour drive, but it's a complete different world. I mean, the difference between suburbia in the west and the left alone provinces in the east is huge. In my opinion, actually, the Ukrainian steppe, they start somewhere in Twente, which is
Yeah,
that's where I'm from. So it has that remote feeling to it.
So let's talk a little bit about the characters. There are 3 former school friends. The main character is obviously Paul, and he has a great friend, Hedvig, if I'm pronouncing that right. And then there's another person that they're not very keen on. We could perhaps call him the baddie, and he's called Lawrence Stegink. And I wondered what kind of connotations that has in Dutch, because in English it's a sort of mixture of gunk and stink. He's, you know, we don't like him from the get-go. Does it have the same connotations, or is it a perfectly ordinary Dutch surname?
These names are actually quite common in the east of the Netherlands. It's a as I said, a rural, mostly Catholic part of the country. Complaints are that people pay just as much. Hoe zeg je dat, Sam, ook alweer? Belasting, taxes as in the rest of the Netherlands, but they have only half the benefit from it. So they only see police at Friday night when they come to control when they have their controls for alcohol and alcohol and driving. So that's the only time when they see the police, actually. So it not only feels remote, but it's also a bit left alone by the authorities.
The characters all have their own sense of isolation from each other and the landscape that they're in. There's farming landscapes, there's sort of those zones that are very intermediate. It's really close to the border. All this is really crucial for the feel of the book, isn't it?
It is, and I actually never found my material in cities or in crowded areas. I always need this isolated feel before I can start writing, because in a city I don't know what to choose. So much is going on, so many conflicts. Whereas in this part of the Netherlands where I'm from, in Twente, not much happens on the surface, but underneath, that's where you have to search for. And I watched closely the process of the incoming of newcomers in Twente. The first were the Chinese. The Chinese took over a local restaurant, which was like something huge happening, like a revolution. For the first time, they ate something Chinese. And I am more interested in the effect that has on a local society than in a city, probably. Yeah.
So let's talk about Paul a little bit. We see much of the action through his eyes, and he's a really fascinating character. How did his character develop? Did you already have the voice and the sort of person that you wanted to write about, or was he shaped by the events along the way? Just tell us a little bit more about who he is.
I think he's the product of mainly of his upbringing. I mean, his mother left when he was around 11, no, earlier, 9. And then he stayed alone with his father in this huge farmhouse. This is the main shape for the rest of his life. He stays with his father, and he never leaves the home of his parents. I saw that happening with a lot of friends of mine, actually, whom I grew up with in this area. They never left home, and in that sense always stayed children, a child. And also the market for marriage isn't that big in Twente, so they stayed alone as well for most part of their lives. So Paul Cruzen is a product of that. I went to school, a Catholic boys' school, with quite a few of these lads, and I sort of shaped him from all these different characters, which became Paul Cruzen.
Would you say that you in a way escaped from the sort of scenario that we see in the novel as a journalist and a thinker and a writer?
Yeah, but I was already a stranger in this area because, or in this village, Geesteren, because I came from the Dutch Antilles. That's where I grew up. Yeah. So I arrived in Geesteren when I was around 11 years old. That makes you a stranger for the rest of your life. So I came in late and left early. But in the meantime, I collected some very dear memories, and these are the memories which are the first layer of the book.
I'd like to bring Sam in here. You've translated many Dutch novels.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to hear from you a little bit about Tommy's style and perhaps any kind of tricky qualities, anything that's difficult to get across in English.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know before I say this, I already think, oh God, this sounds like a cliche, but in fact, one of the interesting things about Tommy is that with every book of his that I've translated, I have the feeling that he is reinventing himself. And that's, I mean, often people say that and it's just sort of, but in Tommy's case, it really applies. Starting with Joe Speedboat and then going to Cesarion, and then these are the names. If you go through those books, you see that there's really nothing that, except perhaps for Tommy's craftsmanship in writing, there's nothing that really says, oh yeah, this is the follow-up to Cesarion, or this is the follow-up to these are the names. It doesn't happen each and every time. I'm sort of taken by surprise. And that's a challenge, of course, because I often have the feeling that every time I sit down to translate a book of Tommy's, that I'm sort of moving back to square one and saying, okay, what's he doing here? And how does he do that? The thing that probably runs through it is consistently is that what I called craftsmanship, is that sense of writing with a lot of impact and with a lot of empathy, and that's a constant. But otherwise, I'm often amazed, like, wow, here we go, and this is not what I did last time. So, forget the tricks that you think you may have learned last time. And maybe Tommy has the same thing as he's writing. Maybe he's starting off forgetting tricks and then teaching himself new ones. But it's surprising, because I've of course translated a lot of writers and often a number of books by different writers, but that particular feeling and that sort of radical reinvention every time is something I really have specifically with Tommy.
That's and especially, sorry that I'm interrupting, but this is where what takes the most time actually to reinvent your writing all the time. Maybe not so much the writing, but the background, the different characters. So I picked them from the whole width of life. And the main thing is, Sam, I really like it that you say that, because I don't want to bore myself in writing. And if you do the same, I mean, we of course all, as a writer, you're a one-trick pony. That's what you do. You write. And in order to stimulate myself, I force myself to come up with something new, with in language, but also in characters. So thank you for that.
At the same time, I can imagine publishers saying, the last one was so great, can't, you know, it won a prize, can't you just pretty much do what you did last time? Do they ever get...
The first publisher who says that will shoot him. Of course not, they can't do that, because they embrace you as a writer, not as a one-trick pony.
Yeah. The product.
So they... No, if you have a good publisher, they stimulate that what makes you strong.
Now, Paul has an unusual way of earning money, which is that he's very much got into Nazi memorabilia in a very big way. That in itself seemed to be something to do with this whole idea of borders. He can kind of nip across into former East Germany, pick up things. He's got a great eye. He's got good skills.
Yeah.
Is this an uncomfortable subject in Holland, or are we far enough away from the war? I mean, what's it say about him that he does this?
It's there are many people who trade in Nazi memorabilia. It's nothing that surprises no one, actually. Let's see what I've got here. Let me.
Not a Luger, I hope. I mean,
yeah.
These are two of the objects I picked up along the way while writing the book. There's a very small helmet. So it must have been a very young Wehrmacht soldier. No, but this is, for instance, very interesting, because this is a Luger from 1918. And you might remember that in the book, this gun disappears. Mm-hmm. And Paul is afraid for the gun that disappeared, because it can be used against him now, in his sense of paranoia, which happens at the end of the book. So here am I. I'm going to Twente. I nearly finished my book, and I thought I'm going for one more round of research. And then I met this car salesman, whom I knew from my childhood, and he had a Sherman tank in his working space. And I said, "What is this Sherman tank?" And he said, "You don't know. I'm interested in memorabilia from the war. I have a whole museum." And then he took me across the street, and he has a whole museum with 100,000 objects from the Second World War, and he sells cars. And then he had a whole lot of Lugers there, and I said, "Wow!" And I'm fascinated by how it's designed.
Yeah, the technology.
The technology of it is fantastic. So I knew quite a lot about it. And he said, "You're interested in Lugers? Here's my Luger. Here, you got it." So the Luger that disappears from my book suddenly appeared in real life. So these are the miracles you need when you write.
Yeah.
So that's that about memorabilia from the war. There's nothing criminal about it in the Netherlands.
What do you think about that, Sam? I mean, I started to think that, you know, we need to take a closer look at Paul, really, but maybe I'm overthinking that.
In that way, you know, of course, the thing is that Paul, his father was a teacher, and a historian, and I see Paul's interest in that Nazi memorabilia and the sort of the knowledge that he sort of brings to bear, that you see in his collector's mania and his understanding of what it is that he really has, as a sort of a continuation in his own way of his father's character. So I wasn't as surprised by it. Nazi memorabilia, it's not something that, it's not my hobby, but I remember smiling when I read the book and got to the passage where Tommy was talking about Luger and the technology that it uses, the recoil of firing to reload from the chamber, which is a fairly brilliant technological move, you know, on the part of the design. And I had, there's been something that had occurred to me before, and then when I caught that Tommy was fascinated by that idea as well, you could just pick that up from his description of it. I had to smile. I thought, yeah, that's right. There is something, even we may abhor handguns, but at the same time, there is something beautiful about that.
Oh yes, and the war brings about many new inventions, which are which after the war are helpful. So that's and with Paul, it also has to do with his fascination for history as a whole. Yeah. So he has this metal detector, and he on this field just outside his house, he finds the pieces of a little aircraft which fell in this field. And when he finds, for instance, the wheel of this aircraft and the compass, he feels that he is part of history. Something which had happened before he was there suddenly reappears, and he finally becomes part of it, because this aircraft plays a role in his personal history, because his mother leaves with the pilot. So with his historical interest, he becomes part of history itself.
Those are the items that are in the cabinet marked not for sale.
Yes.
He still keeps these little things. At the same time, though, he deals in these objects, and there is a little throwaway remark almost about, well, the people ordering this, they're probably young neo-Nazi skinheads, you know, and he's pretty dismissive about it, but at the same time that implicates him, doesn't it, in the darker side of this trade. I thought it was interesting that we're not necessarily invited to think of Paul. He's a complex person, but he has good qualities, but we're not invited to think he's a good guy. And that interested me.
No, I think if you would meet him in real life, you would keep a little distance, because there's a certain smell to loneliness. There's something which give you a sense of that you might dislike him. But for me, I find him interesting because he deals with his loneliness, and he deals with the fact that he's unable to conquer in the erotic market, for instance. That's why he travels to Asia a lot, which is not per se very sympathetic, but I do sympathize with him, because I understand this loneliness, and I understand it, that when you're not part of that market, that you go out to get your share anyway. Yeah. It is sad in a way, but I tried not to make too many harsh notions about it.
Yeah, there isn't.
So I have sympathy for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Sam, were there any passages that you found either particularly wonderful to render in English or particularly difficult?
There are a number that I found quite wonderful to do. I remember the different scenes. I think the opening of the book, when Paul is out chopping wood, that was a lot of fun to translate, and at the same time, this sort of wonderful, sort of lyrical passage, and at the same time had the impression right away that this is a person who is not just chopping wood, but sort of following up what Tommy is just saying, somebody who's sort of chopping wood with some hurt behind what it is that he's doing, and if you know what I mean. We're getting a feeling for Paul already at that point. I remember greatly enjoying trying to do that, and trying to do it in the way that Tommy did it, or as close as I could get to that. There are points in the story that were that were a lot of fun as far as translating goes. There's this scene, let me see, I'm going to be careful here, a spoiler alert.
No, then never mind, because it's not about the plot.
Okay, all right, okay. Now there's a scene anyway when Paul shows up at one of his favorite venues and sees the people who were there unexpectedly, that they're having a celebration. and the women and the men are sort of dressed up in period costume, which is kind of a funny thing with Paul with his history and his memorabilia, thing like that. He sort of walks in on this sort of role-playing thing, and in a venue where he was planning to wreak havoc, and that was just fun to do. Just the description, sort of the women in their nurses' uniforms, sort of tapping around on high heels, and the men in their costumes and things. That was just funny. So that was fun. I really enjoyed doing that. What was interesting and what was a challenge often is that, of course, Tommy mentioned the Chinese proprietors of the restaurant in the town, and they, you know, in some ways, that like the arrival of the Chinese in the village apparently is almost sort of it's almost like a force of nature. Something has gone, there's a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled in by the Chinese. But in this book, the new proprietors of the restaurant are never just something that comes in and fills the vacuum. They're people. So we have descriptions of one of the waitresses who works there and who's also, I think, a fairly lonely person, and is described in also her unattractiveness, but with great sympathy, great empathy. And that was nice to translate. It was interesting to translate, to see if I really understood that and to see if I could do that too. So that's I guess the interesting thing about translating things that you like, is that you get to see whether you can do that too. It's a game in some ways of follow the leader that is challenging and fun.
That's for me, these people you describe, so the Chinese woman and Paul himself. I know these people. I collect lives for my work, and it's always the ethical questions. What can you take from someone else's life for your writing? Mm-hmm. So I wasn't too sure if what I did was good, if I could tell them what I did. Yeah. But finally I went to Geester and I gave them the book, and the Chinese, for instance, they were very happy with it. Wow. They gave me a free meal, and I really want to give, no, because of your book, people come to our restaurants, so here's your free meal. Oh, so there's some tourism came from it.
I think this is something you should develop in future books. Think where you really want to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fantastic meal.
Yeah, no, but that's of course the problem. We talked about it before, Sam and I. But what can you take from someone else's lives? Mm-hmm. And that's an ongoing problem, because of course as a writer you're nothing more than a thief, actually. If and many things are too good to be to ignore. So I had to go to this restaurant and watch carefully how these people, how the people from Geester relate to the Chinese, the newcomers. It's a very interesting dynamics you see there. Yeah. And it's also that they never really meet. There's always a bar in between them. So this bar, which is about 1 meter broad, this is the constant distance between them. Yeah, it's like a corona distance.
That's a corona.
But then for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on, I think, a kind of metaphor that runs through the book, and that is of rot and decay. And at one particularly dramatic moment, which I'm definitely not going to give away, you can almost feel a stench coming off the pages. Mm-hmm. Is that stench what we might call toxic masculinity? Because it's a very male book in lots of ways. You know, there's an absent mother, there are a few waitresses, and there are these women in the brothel. You know, we're not sure how they have come to Holland, but it seems to be the action of a certain sort of maleness upon the world. I found it really fascinating. So if you could just pick up on that point, the rot, the stench that we feel.
Sam?
Yeah, this is thanks. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly sure here when I think about what the stench is that you're referring to, Susan. I do know what you mean by that sort of that feeling of maybe the rabid masculinity of someone like Stechink in this case, who's obviously the pimp, the proprietor, very hard-handed proprietor of this brothel, where Paul is also sort of, he's of course implicated in. He's the customer. He goes there. The way that Stechink runs it is of course, there's nothing really good that you can say about the way that Stechink sort of runs anything.
Things rot away in the novel. Buildings rot away.
That's true.
Lives rot away.
That's true.
People do.
Old things disappear. Things fall apart.
Yeah.
That's true. That is really true. And like the description as well, of course, of the farmhouse we were talking about, where Paul lives with his father, and this rambling farmhouse that is so big that there are parts of it that you only maybe visit twice in your life. That's fascinating. Yeah. And the description as well, sort of this old farm machinery rusting away, that he sort of walks between, and you can feel that. You can feel the dust and the decay. The grandfather's water mill that then sort of goes out of business, falls apart. The way things happen, even it is true. There's that passage of time, which is of course what the background to this book as well. Things go by, things fall apart, things disappear, they rust away. Paul, for example, in his way, tries to find things again and trying to put things together in some ways, give them a place in his private or public museum in a different way than his father did, but his father was also busy with that sort of thing. The idea that these old farmhouses, people tearing down old farmhouses and then building up sort of replicas of Saxon farmhouses, things like that, is funny, but is very much spot on, is very much true. You do see in a lot of the rural Netherlands. And of course, also, now as I think about it and moving on, Hedwig too, his demise that you're also referring to, Suzi, is that, it is, there is, that's ultimately sort of the way of all flesh, horribly enough.
Yeah, and for me, that the sense of decay, it has to do with the area itself. It's not so, hoe zeg je dat? So over, let's see how to say that. Over aestheticized. Is that a word in English?
Well, we just made it a word.
It is now.
It is now, yeah. So for me, it's important to find a place where you can write actually, where people are not so self-aware, where things are not so self-aware, where you find some space between the objects. Whereas here in the West, where we live, normally Sam is now in France, but here in the West, everything is so aware of itself, and it's so aestheticized, so beautiful and well made. And for me, it starts where things are just there because they have a function, sheer function. And also where not so many people are around. We talked about that before, but I need space in order to write. And there's this beautiful remark by Milan Kundera in his book about how to write a novel. What happened, he asks himself, to adventure, the first big theme of a novel. Then he says, okay, the kind of adventure that you can see in Don Quixote, for instance, where Don Quixote travels into the world and has all this space at hand. I added Moby Dick to it, for instance. It's also a novel about vast space, and Heart of Darkness, of course. These are novels that you cannot situate them in a city. You need space for that. And so because of that sentence, because of that, I realized that what I'm looking for my writing is indeed decay comes with it, but first there's space.
And also, it is the countryside. The countryside is all around, and as people fade away and plans disappear and things that you want to do don't pan out, the leaves still come back to life every year, as they are doing right at this moment. I think we're pretty much at the end of the session now, and I wanted to, we've talked about toxic masculinity and
you did, we didn't.
I did.
Yeah.
I brought this to the table. So I want to end much more positively and say that it's a thrilling and fascinating novel. It really grips you. I absolutely could not stop reading. About the last 120 pages just kept me awake. It's been quite difficult to shake off. It's fascinating. It's got lots of layers. It's a brilliant novel. Props to Sam for his amazing translation, which gives a sense of Dutchness, but yet you feel, you know, you're definitely reading a novel in English. So I'd like to thank you very much, both of you, for spending a bit of time with me, each in our separate rooms. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks everybody for joining us here. I would just like to say that we have a hashtag, which is New Dutch Writing. If you'd like to make any comments about this little show that we've been doing here, please do so via that. And join us on Wednesday, the 27th of May at 7 p.m. The next event is with Charlotte van den Broek and her translator, David Colmer. You can sign up for these events at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. Thank you very much again, Sam and Tommy, for a great discussion.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzi. Bye.
Bye-bye.